The house had always been too large for the family that lived in it, and too small for the resentment it contained. It rose from the end of Maple Ridge Lane, like a quiet monument to better days. 3 stories of aging brick and weathered shutters, with ivy crawling up the eastern wall, as though the earth itself was trying to pull the structure back into the ground. The roof sagged gently near the chimney. The gutters had rusted through in places, leaving dark mineral stains running down the facade like old tears. The porch, once broad and welcoming, now leaned slightly forward, its boards warped by decades of rain and neglect. Inside, the rooms carried the faint, persistent smell of dust and lavender, a combination that belonged to the woman who had lived there longest and loved it most. Margaret Hollis had spent 53 years in that house. She had raised 4 children within its walls, buried 2 husbands from its front door, and watched the neighborhood change around her without ever once considering leaving. The house was not simply where she lived. It was how she lived. Every crack in the plaster, every stubborn window that refused to open without a fight, every floorboard that groaned in the hallway at night. These were not flaws. They were conversations, familiar voices that reminded her she was never truly alone. When Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in late October, the silence that followed was louder than anything the house had ever known. She passed quietly in her sleep, in the same bedroom where she had spent her wedding night, where she had nursed fevers and read bedtime stories, where she had wept privately after each loss and risen again each morning to face whatever came next. The hospice nurse found her with one hand resting on the quilt her mother had sewn, her expression calm, as though she had simply decided that 53 years was enough and the house could carry on without her. The family arrived within days, not to grieve, but to divide. There were 4 of them. Richard, the eldest, had left the town before his 20th birthday and returned only when obligation demanded it. He worked in commercial real estate 3 states away, wore suits that cost more than Margaret's monthly groceries, and spoke about the house in terms of square footage and market value. He had not visited his mother in over a year before her death, though he called occasionally, in conversations that lasted precisely as long as courtesy required, and not a moment longer. Victoria came next. She had married well, or at least expensively, and lived in a gated community where the lawns were trimmed by people whose names she never learned. She viewed the house on Maple Ridge Lane as an embarrassment, a relic of poverty she had spent her adult life distancing herself from. When she spoke of her childhood there, it was always with a careful edit, softening the edges, omitting the parts that didn't match the narrative she preferred. Then there was Dennis, the middle child in both birth order and temperament. He had stayed closer to home than the others, though not out of loyalty. Dennis drifted. He changed jobs the way other people changed shoes, never quite finding the right fit, always blaming circumstance rather than effort. He had borrowed money from Margaret more times than anyone could count, and repaid it in promises that expired before they matured. He wanted the house because he wanted the money it represented, not because he wanted to live in it. And then there was Clara. Clara was the youngest, and in the language of the family, the least. She had heard that word applied to her so often and in so many forms that it had become a kind of second name. The least ambitious, the least successful, the least likely to amount to anything worth mentioning at holiday dinners. She was 31 years old, a single mother to a 6-year-old daughter named Lily, and she worked 2 jobs that between them barely covered rent on an apartment whose heating failed every winter. So she drove a car held together by habit and prayer. She wore shoes until the soles wore through, then wore them a little longer. She had not taken a vacation in 4 years, and the last one had been a weekend trip to a lake 40 minutes away, where Lily had caught her first fish, and Clara had cried quietly behind her sunglasses because she could not remember the last time her daughter had laughed that freely. Clara had been the one who visited Margaret, not once a year, not when guilt demanded it. Every week, sometimes more, she drove to the house on Maple Ridge Lane and sat with her grandmother in the kitchen, drinking tea from cups so old the patterns had faded to ghosts. She listened to stories she had heard 100 times before and laughed at jokes whose punchlines she could recite from memory. She brought Lily, so who called Margaret Nana Maggie, and drew pictures that Margaret taped to the refrigerator with the reverence other families reserved for diplomas. Clara did not visit because she expected anything in return. She visited because she loved her grandmother, simply and without condition, the way Margaret had loved the house. The reading of the will took place on a Friday afternoon in the office of Harold Briggs, Margaret's attorney for over 30 years. The room was small, wood-paneled, and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old leather. Harold was a careful man who had watched the Hollis family dynamics with the quiet attention of someone who had seen too many inheritances tear apart what death had not. He read the document slowly, pausing after each clause as though giving the words time to settle before the reactions began. The house, Margaret had written, was to be divided among her 4 grandchildren according to her wishes. The language was precise but unusual. Richard would receive the ground floor, including the living room, kitchen, and the formal dining room that had hosted every family gathering for half a century. Victoria would receive the second floor, the bedrooms where they had all slept as children, the bathroom with the cracked tile Margaret had always meant to fix, the hallway lined with framed photographs of faces that grew older as you walked from one end to the other. Dennis would receive the garage, the workshop, and the small garden shed that sat behind the house like a forgotten afterthought. Clara would receive the attic. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before Richard broke it with a laugh. Not a cruel laugh, not exactly, but the kind that carried a message nonetheless. The attic, of course. The room no one wanted, given to the person no one considered. It was so perfectly fitting that he could not suppress his amusement. Victoria pressed her lips together and looked away, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction. She had always believed that inheritance should reflect contribution, and by her accounting, Clara had contributed nothing of measurable value. Dennis leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, already calculating what his portion of the property might fetch if he could convince the others to sell quickly. Clara sat very still. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers laced together, knuckles white. She stared at the document Harold held, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something different if she waited long enough. The attic. She had spent hours there as a child, playing among boxes and forgotten furniture, imagining worlds inside the dust motes that danced in the light from the small oval window. It was the highest room in the house, the closest to the sky, and the farthest from everything else. Now it was hers, and she could feel the weight of what that meant pressing against her chest. Harold continued reading, his voice steady and deliberate. Margaret's will contained an additional clause that he delivered without inflection, but with careful emphasis. Each recipient was granted full autonomy over their designated portion of the property. They could renovate, occupy, or sell their share independently, provided they did not interfere with the others' portions. The house would remain whole unless all 4 parties agreed to sell it as a single unit. Any disputes would be mediated through Harold's office. The clause was a lock. Margaret had known her grandchildren well enough to anticipate the arguments and had built walls within the will to contain them. Whether those walls would hold remained to be seen. Outside the attorney's office, the family gathered on the sidewalk in a loose, uncomfortable cluster. The October air carried the smell of burning leaves and the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the block. Richard was the first to speak. He suggested, with the practiced tone of someone accustomed to steering conversations toward his preferred outcome, that they sell the entire property immediately. The market was favorable. A quick sale would yield a clean split. Everyone could walk away satisfied. Victoria agreed without hesitation. She had no interest in occupying any part of the house, and even less interest in maintaining it. Dennis nodded along, though his agreement was motivated less by financial wisdom than by impatience. He wanted cash, not property. Cash was portable. Cash did not require repairs. Clara said nothing. She stood slightly apart from the others, her coat pulled tight against the wind, her eyes fixed on something in the middle distance that none of them could see. When Richard repeated his suggestion more pointedly, directing it at her, as though she had not heard, she finally spoke. She said she wanted to keep her share. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Richard blinked. Victoria turned sharply. Dennis uncrossed his arms and stared at her, as though she had spoken in a language he did not recognize. The silence that followed was different from the one in Harold's office. This silence carried heat. Richard recovered first. He explained slowly, as though speaking to someone who had not understood the situation, that the house could only be sold as a whole if all four agreed. By refusing to sell, Clara was effectively blocking the entire transaction. She was holding the rest of them hostage to a sentimentality that served no practical purpose. The attic, he reminded her, was not a home. It was a storage space with a window. It had no kitchen, no bathroom, no plumbing beyond a single faucet that may or may not still function. The roof above it leaked. The insulation was decades old. Living there would be not just impractical, but foolish. Victoria added that the entire property was worth approximately $420,000 in its current condition. Split 4 ways, that was over $100,000 each. For Clara, that money could mean a new apartment, a better car, a savings account for Lily's education. Why would she trade all of that for an attic? Dennis said nothing useful, but his expression made his position clear. He wanted the money, and Clara was standing in the way. Clara listened to all of it. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply repeated that she wanted to keep her share. The attic was hers, and she intended to make something of it. When pressed for a reason, she offered one that none of them expected. She said that Nana Maggie had given her the attic for a reason. She was not going to disrespect that by selling it before she even stepped inside. The conversation ended there, though the resentment did not. Richard left first, his car door closing with the sharp, definitive sound of someone accustomed to having the last word. Victoria followed shortly after, her heels clicking against the sidewalk, with a rhythm that suggested displeasure held just barely in check. Dennis lingered long enough to tell Clara she was making a mistake before driving away in a truck that needed a muffler more urgently than he needed an opinion. Clara stood alone on the sidewalk. The wind picked up, carrying a chill that seeped through her coat and settled against her skin. She thought about the money. $100,000 was more than she had ever possessed at one time in her life. It would solve problems she had been struggling with for years. It would give Lily stability, warmth, a future that did not depend on Clara's ability to hold 2 jobs without collapsing. And yet, something held her. Something that lived in the space between logic and instinct, between what made sense and what felt right. Margaret had divided the house with intention. Every clause in that will had been chosen with the same care Margaret applied to everything she did. The attic was not a leftover. It was a gift. And gifts from Margaret always carried meaning, even when that meaning was not immediately visible. Clara drove home slowly, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her mind turning the decision over and over like a stone being smoothed by water. When she arrived at her apartment, Lily was waiting at the kitchen table, drawing with crayons on the back of an old grocery receipt. The apartment was cold. The heating had failed again, and the landlord had promised to send someone by Thursday, which in his language meant sometime next week, or possibly never. Lily looked up when Clara entered, her small face bright despite the chill. She asked if Nana Maggie's house was theirs now. Clara sat down across from her daughter and tried to find words that the 6-year-old could hold without being hurt by them. She said that they had been given a piece of it, a special piece, the very top, where the sky was closest. Lily smiled and said she liked being close to the sky. Clara smiled back, though the weight behind it was heavier than her daughter could know. That night, after Lily fell asleep beneath every blanket they owned, Clara sat at the kitchen table and stared at the numbers written on the back of an envelope. Rent was 3 months behind. The car needed brakes. Lily's school had sent home a notice about unpaid activity fees. The credit card balance had crossed a line she tried not to look at directly. Every number on that envelope argued for selling the attic and taking the money. But Clara did not pick up the phone. Instead, she closed her eyes and remembered the last conversation she had with Margaret. It had been a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before the end. Margaret had been sitting in her favorite chair by the kitchen window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She had looked at Clara with an expression that was equal parts love and urgency, as though she was trying to say something that words alone could not carry. She had taken Clara's hand and squeezed it, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so close to leaving. She had said, "The house knows who belongs to it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Clara had not understood the words then. She was beginning to understand them now. The following Monday, Clara drove to the house on Maple Ridge Lane with a set of borrowed tools, a flashlight, and the stubborn intention of seeing the attic for the first time as its owner. The morning was gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but had not yet committed. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, quiet streets lined with aging trees whose leaves had mostly fallen, leaving bare branches that scratched against the sky like reaching fingers. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the house through the windshield. It looked different now. Not physically, the same sagging roof, the same stained gutters, the same ivy creeping upward along the eastern wall. But the knowledge that part of it belonged to her changed the way she saw it. Ownership, she realized, was not just a legal concept, it was a relationship. And relationships required presence. The front door was unlocked. Richard had been by earlier in the week, she knew, walking through the ground floor with a contractor to assess renovation costs. He had already begun treating his portion as an investment property, calculating returns before the grief had even settled. Clara stepped inside and was immediately enveloped by the familiar smell of dust and lavender, fainter now than it had been when Margaret was alive, as though even the scent was beginning to let go. She moved through the ground floor quickly, not wanting to linger in Richard's territory. The kitchen still held traces of Margaret's presence, a calendar on the wall turned to the wrong month, a dish towel folded neatly over the oven handle, a small ceramic bowl on the counter where Margaret had always kept her reading glasses. Clara touched the bowl lightly, then pulled her hand away and continued toward the stairs. The second floor belonged to Victoria, and Clara passed through it without stopping. The bedrooms were empty now, their furniture removed weeks ago by a company Victoria had hired without consulting anyone else. The walls showed rectangles of brighter paint where photographs had hung, ghosts of images that had once made this hallway feel like a museum of family history. But now it was just a corridor, functional and bare. The staircase to the attic was narrow and steep, tucked behind a door at the end of the second-floor hallway that had always been slightly difficult to open. Clara pulled it toward her with both hands and it yielded with a familiar groan, releasing a rush of cool air that smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rusted nails or aged copper. The stairs were bare wood, their surfaces worn smooth in the center by decades of footsteps. She climbed slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. The sound was louder than she remembered, amplified by the enclosed stairwell. Dust motes drifted through the thin light that filtered down from above, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though the house was stirring awake after a long sleep. The attic opened before her, like a memory made physical. The space was larger than most people expected, stretching the full length and width of the house, its ceiling rising to a peak along the central ridge beam. The walls sloped downward on either side, following the angle of the roof, creating alcoves and recesses that had always fascinated Clara as a child. Exposed wooden beams ran overhead, their surfaces darkened by age, but still solid, still bearing the weight of the roof with quiet, dependable strength. The oval window at the far end let in a pale wash of morning light that illuminated floating dust particles and cast a soft, diffused glow across the floor. The glass was old and slightly warped, distorting the view of the backyard below into something impressionistic. A smear of green and brown and gray that looked more like a painting than a landscape. Boxes occupied most of the floor space, dozens of them stacked in uneven towers, their cardboard sides softened by humidity and marked with labels written in Margaret's careful handwriting. Christmas ornaments, 1974. Robert's uniform. Wedding china, handle with care. Lily's baby clothes keep. Clara paused at that last one. Margaret had kept Lily's baby clothes, folded and boxed and labeled and stored with the same care she applied to wedding china. The realization made Clara's throat tighten. She moved deeper into the attic, navigating between the stacks with careful steps. The floorboards were solid but uneven, and she tested each one before committing her full weight. Old furniture occupied the spaces between boxes, as a rocking chair with a broken runner, a writing desk whose surface was scarred with ink stains and ring marks from cups placed without coasters, a standing mirror with a cracked frame that reflected Clara's image back to her in fragments, as though she were a puzzle not yet assembled. Against the far wall, beneath the slope of the roof where the ceiling dropped to its lowest point, something caught her attention. A section of the wall looked different from the rest. The wood paneling, which ran uniformly throughout the attic, appeared slightly mismatched in one area. The color was close, but not identical, a shade lighter, as though the boards had been replaced or added at a different time. The texture was smoother, less weathered, lacking the deep grain patterns that marked the older panels around it. Clara knelt and ran her fingers along the edge of the section. There was a seam, not a crack, not a gap caused by settling or age, but a deliberate line where one surface met another. She pressed against it and felt a subtle give, as though the panel was not fully secured to the structure behind it. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was probably nothing. Old houses were full of patches and repairs, especially in attics, where leaks and damage accumulated over decades. Someone had likely replaced a section of damaged paneling and done a reasonable but imperfect job of matching the original. That was the logical explanation. But logic did not account for the way her skin prickled, or the way the air in the attic seemed to shift, growing cooler and more still, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She pressed harder, and the panel moved. Not outward, not inward, but sideways, sliding along a hidden track with a smoothness that contradicted its apparent age. Behind it, darkness exhaled, a thin breath of stale air carrying the scent of metal and stone, and something ancient that she could not name. Clara leaned back, startled, her heart hammering against her ribs. The opening was narrow, perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. Beyond it, her flashlight revealed a space that should not have existed. She had played in this attic as a child. She had explored every corner, every alcove, every recess where the roof met the walls. She knew this space the way she knew her own hands. And yet, she had never seen this. Never noticed the seam. Never felt the give in the panel. I never suspected that behind the wall, where she had once stacked her grandmother's Christmas boxes, lay something deliberately hidden. Clara sat back on her heels and stared at the opening. The darkness beyond it was absolute, untouched by the pale light from the oval window. She could hear her own breathing, loud and unsteady, and beneath it, the faintest sound, a hum, not mechanical, not electrical, but resonant, as though the space itself vibrated at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight app, adding its beam to the one from the flashlight she already held. The combined light pushed into the darkness and revealed a narrow passage, its walls constructed of brick rather than wood. The bricks were old, their surfaces rough and uneven, and their mortar crumbling in places, but still holding the structure together with the stubbornness of materials built to last. The passage extended perhaps 8 feet before ending at what appeared to be another wall, this one made of stone. Clara did not enter. Not yet. She knelt at the threshold and simply looked, absorbing the impossibility of what she was seeing. The passage was not part of the house's original construction. The bricks were different from those used in the exterior walls, smaller and darker, suggesting a separate source and possibly a separate era. Someone had built this space intentionally, hidden it behind paneling, and ensured that it remained invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Her mind raced through explanations: a hidden closet, a Prohibition-era stash, a safe room built during some long-forgotten moment of fear, an architectural quirk sealed away during a renovation. Each explanation was plausible. None of them felt adequate. She pulled back from the opening and sat on the attic floor, her back against a stack of boxes, her flashlight pointed at the ceiling. The dust motes continued their slow, indifferent dance. The oval window let in light that was growing brighter as the clouds began to thin. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and then fell silent. Clara thought about calling someone. Richard would want to know, if only to assess the impact on property value. Victoria would dismiss it as irrelevant to her portion of the house. Dennis would want to know if anything inside was worth selling. None of them would understand why Clara felt what she felt in that moment. A mixture of fear and recognition, as though she had been meant to find this passage and was only now arriving at a destination that had been waiting for her all along. She thought about Margaret, about the will, about the careful, deliberate way her grandmother had divided the house, giving each grandchild a portion that reflected something Margaret knew about them. Richard got the ground floor because he valued foundations and control. Victoria got the bedrooms because she cared about appearances and comfort. Dennis got the garage because he was always tinkering without finishing. And Clara got the attic, the highest point, the place where things were stored and forgotten, the place where secrets lived. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. No missed calls, no messages. The world outside this attic had not changed. It continued to spin at its usual pace, indifferent to the fact that Clara Hollis, single mother, two-job worker, the least of the Hollis grandchildren, had just discovered something hidden in the walls of the home she had inherited. She did not call anyone. Instead, she stood, brushed the dust from her knees, and looked at the opening one more time. The darkness inside had not changed. The passage waited, patient and silent, offering nothing but the promise that what lay beyond would alter everything that came after. Clara picked up her flashlight, adjusted her grip, and stepped toward the opening. The house seemed to lean in around her, its old bones shifting with a sound that might have been settling or might have been something else entirely. She ducked her head, angled her shoulders, and crossed the threshold into the passage. The air changed immediately. It was cooler inside, markedly so, as though the temperature dropped several degrees within the first step. The walls were close, pressing in from both sides, forcing her to move sideways in places where the bricks narrowed the path. Her flashlight beam bounced off rough surfaces, casting shadows that jumped and shifted with every movement. The floor beneath her feet was stone, smooth and slightly damp, worn by something she could not identify. She reached the far wall in 7 careful steps. It was stone, as she had seen from outside, but up close, she noticed details that the distance had obscured. The stone was not uniform. Several blocks near the center were slightly recessed, their surfaces smoother than those around them, as though they had been handled repeatedly. And along the bottom edge, where the stone met the floor, a thin line of mortar was missing entirely, leaving a gap just wide enough to suggest that this wall, like the panel behind her, was not as permanent as it appeared. Clara crouched and examined the gap. Cool air flowed through it, carrying a scent that was different from the passage, deeper, older, tinged with something earthy and metallic. She pressed her fingers against the recessed stones and felt them shift slightly under the pressure. Not loose exactly, but movable, as though they were designed to be removed by someone who knew the sequence. She tried the top stone first. It resisted, then grated softly and slid forward half an inch. The second stone, directly below it, moved more easily. The third required more force, but eventually yielded. As each stone shifted, the gap at the bottom widened, and the flow of air increased, bringing with it a sound she had not noticed before. A faint, rhythmic tapping, irregular but persistent, like water dripping onto metal somewhere deep within the walls. Clara removed 4 stones before the opening was large enough to see through. She aimed her flashlight into the space beyond and felt her breath catch, her body freezing in place as her mind tried to process what the light revealed. The space behind the wall was a room, not a closet, not a crawl space, but a room with a ceiling high enough to stand in, and walls lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling on 3 sides. The shelves were not empty. They held objects arranged with a precision that suggested not storage, but display. And even from her limited vantage point, so even with the narrow beam of her flashlight illuminating only a fraction of what the room contained, Clara could see that the objects on those shelves were not ordinary. They gleamed. The light caught their surfaces and reflected back in warm, heavy tones that she recognized instinctively, the way anyone would recognize the color of something they had seen in pictures and dreams but never held in their hands. Gold. Not decorative, not plated, not costume pieces arranged for effect, but dense, solid, unmistakable gold, shaped into bars and coins and objects she could not yet identify, arranged on shelves that sagged slightly under a weight that defied casual estimation. Clara's hands trembled. The flashlight beam shook, sending light dancing across the surfaces of the bars, on each one catching and releasing the glow as though the metal itself was breathing. She counted what she could see from where she knelt. 8 bars on the nearest shelf. Behind them, another row. Behind that, shapes she could not quite make out, but that carried the same unmistakable color, the same dense, heavy presence. She did not move. She did not speak. She knelt in the narrow passage between the attic she had known her entire life, and a room that had existed behind its walls for longer than she could guess, and she stared at a fortune that her mind refused to calculate. The tapping sound continued, steady and indifferent, as though the room had been waiting for someone to find it, and felt no urgency now that the moment had arrived. Clara's breathing was the only other sound. It filled the passage, shallow and fast, the rhythm of a heart trying to outrun the reality it had just collided with. She thought of Margaret, of the will, of the attic, of the last words her grandmother had spoken to her, words that had seemed cryptic at the time, but now rang with a clarity that was almost unbearable. The house knows who belongs to it. Clara knelt in the darkness, her flashlight pointed at a fortune hidden behind stones and silence, and she understood at last what Margaret had always known. The attic was not a consolation prize. It was not the leftover portion given to the least of the grandchildren. It was the heart of the house, the place where Margaret had kept her deepest secret, the one she trusted only to the person she loved most. Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the gold was still there. Patient. Heavy. Real. She sat back slowly, her shoulders pressing against the cool bricks of the passage wall. Her hands shook, her vision blurred with tears she did not try to stop. The weight of everything she had carried, the debt, the exhaustion, the quiet shame of never having enough, the fear that Lily would grow up learning the taste of scarcity before she learned anything else, all of it pressed against her chest, and then, slowly, began to lift. Not because the gold solved everything, not because money was the answer to the questions that kept her awake at night, but because Margaret had seen her, had known her, had trusted her with something enormous and fragile and important, not because Clara was the least, but because she was the one who would understand what it meant. The attic was quiet around her. The dust motes continued their patient drift. The oval window glowed with the pale light of a morning that had no idea what had just happened within these walls. Clara wiped her eyes, steadied her breathing, and picked up her flashlight. She was not finished. She had barely begun. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like a door, sliding open along a hidden track, revealing a passage that led somewhere she had never dared to imagine, and she was going to walk through it. The walk back through the passage felt different from the walk in. The air was the same. The temperature had not changed. The bricks pressed close on either side with the same unyielding presence. But Clara moved through it now with a steadiness that surprised her, as though the discovery had rearranged something fundamental inside her chest. And fear was still present, but it had been displaced, pushed aside by a weight that was heavier and more immediate, the weight of responsibility. She emerged from the hidden opening and stood in the attic, blinking against the pale light from the oval window. The boxes and old furniture surrounded her exactly as before, undisturbed witnesses to a revelation they could not comprehend. Margaret's handwriting on the nearest box read, "Table linens, guest room," in letters that were beginning to fade. Clara stared at those words and felt a sudden, fierce tenderness for the woman who had written them. Margaret had lived in this house for over half a century, had packed and labeled and stored the artifacts of a life lived fully, and all the while she had known what lay behind the wall. She had known, and she had kept the secret, on carrying it alone through decades of dinners and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, waiting for the right person to find it. Clara slid the panel back into place, covering the opening with the same care Margaret must have used countless times before. The seam disappeared into the pattern of the wood, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She stepped back and examined her work. Perfect. Or close enough that no casual observer would notice anything unusual. She sat down on a dusty trunk near the center of the attic and pulled out her phone. Her hands were still trembling, though the tremor had softened from shock into something closer to adrenaline. She opened the calculator app and stared at the blank screen, then closed it again. She did not know enough yet to calculate anything. She did not know how many bars there were, how much they weighed, what else the room contained. The glimpse she had caught was enough to tell her the amount was significant. But significant was a word that covered an enormous range. And Clara had learned long ago not to build hopes on foundations she had not yet measured. What she needed now was information. And what she needed even more urgently was discretion. She thought about who she could tell. The list was painfully short. Richard would try to claim the discovery as part of the house's overall value, arguing that a hidden room behind a shared wall belonged to all 4 heirs. Victoria would involve lawyers before the conversation ended. Dennis would tell someone, anyone, everyone, because Dennis had never successfully kept a secret in his life. Clara could not afford any of those outcomes. Not yet. Not until she understood what she had and what it meant. There was one person she trusted without reservation, but that person was 6 years old and more interested in crayons than gold bars. Clara allowed herself a small, exhausted smile at the thought of Lily's face, if she could see what her mother had just found. The smile faded quickly, replaced by the sobering awareness that the discovery, if mishandled, could make everything worse rather than better. Wealth without preparation was a different kind of danger, one she had seen destroy people who lacked the structure to contain it. She stood, brushed the dust from her clothes, and descended the attic stairs with careful, measured steps. The second floor was empty and silent, now Victoria's territory stripped bare and waiting for whatever renovation would eventually transform it into something profitable. The ground floor still smelled faintly of Margaret, though Clara noticed that someone had removed the dish towel from the oven handle. Richard's contractor, probably, clearing the space for measurements. Clara locked the front door behind her and walked to her car. The neighborhood was quiet. A few leaves skittered across the sidewalk. The mailbox at the end of the driveway still leaned at the same angle it had leaned at for years, its door hanging slightly open, like a mouth caught mid-sentence. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, her forehead resting against the steering wheel, her eyes closed. The gold was real. She had touched the stones that concealed it. She had felt the cool air flowing from the room. She had seen the way light moved across surfaces that only gold could produce, that warm, dense glow that seemed to generate its own gravity. It was real, and it was behind the wall of the attic that Margaret had given to her, and no one else in the world knew it existed. The engine turned over on the second try, the same reluctant cough it always produced, and Clara pulled out of the driveway. As she drove, her mind worked through the immediate priorities with a clarity that felt almost foreign. She needed to return to the attic with better tools. She needed to fully access the room and document everything inside it. She needed to understand the scope of what she was dealing with before she took any action that could not be undone. And she needed to do all of this without drawing the attention of 3 family members who already viewed her with a mixture of pity and impatience, any one of whom would complicate the situation beyond recovery if they learned what the attic contained. The drive home took 20 minutes, but Clara barely noticed the road. Her mind was in the attic, behind the wall, inside the room, where gold waited on shelves that sagged beneath its weight. She thought about Margaret's hands, those strong, careful hands that had held hers so tightly during their last conversation. Those hands had known the secret, had maintained it, had built a wall around it, not to keep the world out, but to keep the treasure safe until it could be given to the person who deserved it most. Clara pulled into the parking lot of her apartment complex and turned off the engine. The building looked the same as it always did, gray and tired and indifferent to the lives it sheltered. The heating was probably still broken. The rent was still overdue. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter had not magically disappeared while she was gone. But something had changed, something enormous and invisible and as heavy as gold. Clara got out of the car, locked the door with a key that stuck in the lock the way it always did, and walked toward the entrance. Her steps were steady. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her mind was already planning the next visit to the attic, already compiling a list of what she would need, already rehearsing the calm, ordinary explanations she would offer if anyone asked why she was spending so much time at the house. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time all day, casting a brief, warm light across the parking lot. Clara paused, tilted her face toward it, and breathed. Then she went inside to pick up her daughter. The news of Clara's decision to keep the attic spread through the family, the way all unwelcome information did, quickly and with embellishment. By the following weekend, Richard had called twice, each conversation longer and more pointed than the last. He spoke about market conditions, about the cost of delay, about the absurdity of one person holding up a transaction that would benefit everyone. His tone was measured, but the frustration beneath it sharpened with each exchange, a blade wrapped in silk. So Victoria's approach was different. She did not call. She sent emails, long and carefully worded, filled with figures and projections, and links to real estate listings in the area. Each email built a case, not just for selling, but for the specific irrationality of Clara's position. The subtext was clear. Clara was being selfish. Clara was being foolish. Clara was letting emotion override judgment, and the family would suffer for it. Dennis was the most direct. He showed up at Clara's apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, his truck idling in the parking lot below, its exhaust curling into the cold air like a visible sigh of impatience. He stood in her doorway and told her plainly that she was costing him money, that the house was rotting while she played pretend, that if she did not agree to sell within the month, he would involve a lawyer and force the issue. Clara listened to all of it the way she had learned to listen to storms. She did not argue. She did not defend. She let the words pass over her and around her, absorbing their force without allowing them to change her direction. When Dennis finished, she told him she was sorry he felt that way, but her decision stood. He left without saying goodbye, the truck's tires spitting gravel as he pulled away. Lily, standing behind Clara in the hallway, asked why Uncle Dennis was so angry. Clara knelt and smoothed her daughter's hair and said that sometimes people got upset when things did not go the way they expected. Lily considered this with the gravity only a 6-year-old could muster, and then asked if they could have pancakes. Clara said yes, and for a moment, the weight of the world felt manageable again. But the pressure did not relent. It came from every direction, constant and suffocating, a reminder that Clara's choice had consequences that extended beyond her own life. The family group text, which had been dormant for months, suddenly became active with messages she was clearly meant to see. Links to articles about the declining housing market, screenshots of comparable sales in the neighborhood, a particularly pointed message from Victoria, noting that the property taxes for the house were due in 3 months, and asking, in a tone dripping with false concern, whether Clara had budgeted for her share. Clara had not. She could barely budget for groceries. The financial pressure was the hardest part, not because the numbers were new, but because they were relentless. Every morning brought a fresh reminder that the life she lived operated on margins so thin that a single unexpected expense could collapse the entire structure. The car needed an oil change she could not afford. Lily's winter coat from last year was too small, and the replacement Clara found at the thrift store had a broken zipper she would need to fix by hand. The electric bill arrived with a number that made her stomach clench. Against all of this, the gold in the attic shimmered in her memory like a mirage, beautiful and impossible, and dangerous to trust. She had not returned to the house since the discovery, partly because she needed time to plan, partly because she was afraid. Afraid that a second visit would reveal the room to be smaller than she remembered, or the gold to be something less than it appeared. afraid that hope, once fully committed to, would betray her the way it had betrayed her before. But fear, Clara had learned, was a poor reason to stay still. She chose a Wednesday for her return. Lily was at school. Both of Clara's jobs gave her a narrow window in the middle of the day, 3 hours of freedom carved from a schedule that otherwise left no room for anything unplanned. She packed a small bag with a flashlight, a tape measure, a notebook, a pen, and a digital kitchen scale she had borrowed from a coworker under the pretense of starting a baking project. The scale was not ideal, but it was what she had. The drive to Maple Ridge Lane felt longer than usual, though the route was the same. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel with a tension that made her knuckles ache. She parked in the driveway, and scanned the street for any sign of her siblings' vehicles, and saw none. The house stood quiet and still, its familiar silhouette unchanged against the gray November sky. She let herself in, climbed to the attic, and stood before the section of paneling that concealed the passage. For a long moment, she simply looked at it, searching for any sign that it had been disturbed. The seam was invisible. The wood grain aligned perfectly. Whatever Margaret had built here, she had built it to last. Clara slid the panel open and felt the same rush of cool air, the same scent of metal and stone. The passage waited, dark and narrow, exactly as she had left it. She ducked inside and moved to the far wall, where the stones she had displaced remained slightly askew. She removed them again, this time with more confidence, widening the opening until she could step through it entirely. The room opened around her, and everything she remembered was confirmed. The shelves, the bars, the dense, warm glow of gold illuminated by her flashlight. But now, with better light and calmer nerves, she saw more. Much more. The room was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for Clara to stand upright at its center. The shelves lined 3 walls, floor to ceiling, each one reinforced with metal brackets that had been bolted into the brick. The 4th wall, the one she had entered through, was bare except for the opening, and a small wooden table pushed against the corner. On the table sat a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and darkened with age, and beside it, a small brass key attached to a faded ribbon. Clara approached the shelves first. She needed to understand the scale before she could process anything else. The nearest shelf held gold bars arranged in neat rows, each one roughly the size of a standard brick, but noticeably heavier, their surfaces stamped with markings she did not recognize. She lifted one with both hands, straining against a weight that seemed impossible for an object so small. It was dense in a way that defied her experience with metal, as though it contained more of itself than its dimensions should allow. She set it on the floor and placed her kitchen scale beside it. The scale maxed out at 5 kilograms. The bar exceeded that immediately, the display blinking in protest. She would need a better scale, but even this crude measurement told her what she needed to know. These were not decorative objects, although they were investment-grade bullion, cast and stamped with the precision of professional minting. She counted the bars on the first shelf. 12. She counted the shelves. 9, arranged in 3 columns of 3 across the wall. Not all shelves held bars. Some held coins, hundreds of them, stored in wooden trays with individual compartments. Others held small velvet pouches, their drawstrings pulled tight, their contents shifting with a soft, heavy clink when Clara touched them. The second wall held more bars, these slightly different in size and marking, suggesting different sources or different eras. Mixed among them were objects she had not expected. Small figurines cast in gold, their features worn but still recognizable. Ornate picture frames, empty of pictures, their surfaces engraved with patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another century. A set of gold plates, each one no larger than a saucer, stacked neatly and separated by layers of cloth so old it crumbled at her touch. The third wall was the most startling. Here, the shelves held not gold, but documents. Stacks of paper, bound with twine or clipped together with rusted fasteners. Certificates, she realized as she examined the nearest stack. Bearer bonds, stock certificates, documents whose value she could not begin to estimate without expert help, but whose presence in this room, alongside bars and coins and artifacts of unmistakable worth, suggested that Margaret's secret was even larger than the gold alone. Clara stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the full scope of what surrounded her. The air was cool and still, undisturbed by the world above. The shelves held their contents with the patient gravity of a vault. The silence was total, broken only by the sound of Clara's own breathing and the faint, rhythmic drip of condensation falling from a pipe somewhere in the ceiling. She did not know how long she stood there. Time lost its shape in that room, compressed by the density of what it contained. When she finally moved, it was toward the table in the corner, where the journal and the brass key waited with the quiet inevitability of things that had always been meant for her. She opened the journal carefully, its spine cracking softly, and read the first line written in Margaret's unmistakable hand. "If you are reading this, then you are the one I chose, and the house has given you what I could not give you in life." Clara's vision blurred. She blinked, and tears fell onto the page, darkening the paper in small, spreading circles. She wiped her eyes and continued reading, her hands trembling, her heart so full it ached. The journal told a story that Clara had never known, a story of Margaret's first husband, Robert Hollis, who had worked for decades as a quiet, unremarkable employee of a shipping company that moved goods between countries during and after the Second World War. A man who had discovered, through years of careful observation and discreet inquiry, that the company was moving more than commercial cargo. Gold, confiscated during wartime, rerouted through private channels, hidden in plain sight within shipments no one thought to inspect too closely. Robert had not stolen it, and he had recovered it, piece by piece, over years, redirecting what had been taken and ensuring it did not reach the hands that had claimed it through violence. He had built the room himself, brick by brick, during the years when the house was being renovated and the attic was accessible only to him. He had filled it slowly, patiently, with the understanding that the world would not be kind to someone who possessed what powerful people had lost. Margaret had learned of the room after Robert's death. She had kept the secret, maintained it, protected it with the same stubborn devotion she applied to everything she loved. She had added to the collection over the years, converting savings into gold when the price was low, on purchasing bonds and certificates through channels she described in the journal with a level of financial sophistication that astonished Clara. The journal's final pages were addressed directly to Clara. Margaret wrote of watching her youngest grandchild grow into a woman of quiet strength and relentless love. She wrote of the visits, of the tea, of Lily's drawings taped to the refrigerator. She wrote that wealth without character was a poison, and that she had searched her family for years, looking for someone who possessed both the courage to accept the gift and the wisdom not to be destroyed by it. She had found that person in Clara. The journal ended with a single sentence, written in letters that trembled slightly, as though Margaret's hand had been unsteady, but her conviction had not. Take care of the house. No, and it will take care of you. Take care of Lily, and the world will have what it needs. Clara closed the journal and held it against her chest. The room was silent. The gold waited on its shelves, patient and eternal, unaware of the tears falling onto the leather cover that had protected its story for longer than Clara had been alive. She did not know how much time passed before she stood. She did not know how many tears fell before she stopped crying. She knew only that when she finally placed the journal carefully back on the table, picked up the brass key, and turned toward the opening in the wall, she was no longer the same person who had entered. The attic received her back with the same quiet indifference it always showed. Dust motes, pale light, boxes labeled in a hand that would never write again. Clara slid the panel closed, so checked the seam, and descended the stairs on legs that felt both heavier and lighter than they ever had before. She locked the front door, walked to her car, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The street was empty. The clouds had returned. The world looked exactly the same as it had 3 hours ago. But Clara knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones, like gold settling onto shelves, that nothing would ever be the same again. She started the engine, pulled out of the driveway, and drove toward the school where her daughter was waiting. The future, which had felt for so long like a locked door, now stood open before her. Not because of the gold, not because of the money it represented, but because Margaret had seen her, truly seen her, and had trusted her with everything. Clara drove carefully, the way she always did. She checked her mirrors. She signaled her turns. She obeyed every speed limit and stopped at every sign. The world would not know what she carried for a long time yet, and that was exactly how it needed to be. For now, there were pancakes to make, and a daughter to hold, and a life to live with the quiet, patient strength that Margaret had always recognized as Clara's greatest gift. The gold could wait. It had waited this long. Clara could be patient too. The days that followed the discovery moved at 2 speeds. On the surface, Clara's life continued at the same grinding pace it always had. She woke before dawn, dressed in the dark to avoid waking Lily, drove to her first job at the distribution warehouse, where she sorted packages for 6 hours, then crossed town to her second shift at the diner, where she waited tables until her feet burned, and her smile felt like something borrowed from a version of herself that had more energy. She picked up Lily from the after-school program, made dinner from whatever the pantry offered, helped with homework, read a bedtime story, and collapsed into a sleep so thin that her dreams barely had room to form. But beneath that surface, in the space behind her ribs where no one could see, a second clock ticked. Every moment she was not working or mothering, her mind returned to the room behind the attic wall. She saw the gold in her sleep, not as fantasy, but as fact. She felt the weight of the bar she had lifted, remembered how her arms had strained, how the kitchen scale had blinked in protest at a density it was not built to measure. She heard the faint drip of condensation against the pipe, and she smelled the ancient air that carried the scent of metal and stone, and decades of silence. The journal stayed with her constantly, not physically. She had left it in the room where she found it, but its words traveled with her like a second heartbeat. Margaret's handwriting, careful and steady even in her final years, had spelled out a history that Clara was still trying to absorb. Robert Hollis, quiet and unremarkable to the world, had spent a lifetime recovering what others had stolen, hiding it in plain sight within the walls of a house that no one thought to look at twice. And Margaret, who the family remembered as a simple woman with simple tastes, had maintained that secret for decades, adding to it, protecting it, waiting for the person she trusted enough to inherit it. Clara understood now why the will had been written the way it was. Margaret could not give the gold to all 4 grandchildren, not because she did not love them, but because she knew them. Richard would have sold it immediately, converting history into profit without pausing to understand what it meant. Victoria would have fought over percentages, turning the gift into a legal battle that would consume more than it created. Dennis would have spent it before the dust settled, burning through decades of careful accumulation in a few reckless years. Only Clara would do what Margaret needed someone to do. Only Clara would protect it first and benefit from it second. But protection required knowledge Clara did not yet possess. She needed to understand what the room contained, not just in terms of objects, but in terms of value, legality, and consequence. Gold hidden inside a house for decades carried complications she could barely imagine. Tax implications, provenance questions, the possibility that some of the recovered items had claims against them from governments or institutions that had never stopped looking. Margaret's journal offered context, but not certainty. The path forward required expertise Clara could not provide herself. She spent her lunch breaks at the library, using the public computers to research gold appraisal, estate law, and the process of authenticating precious metals. The information she found was overwhelming in its volume and contradictory in its details. Some sources suggested that inherited gold was subject to capital gains taxes. Others indicated that the tax treatment depended on how and when it was acquired. Legal forums offered conflicting advice about disclosure requirements, and every article she read about treasure troves hidden in homes seemed to end with a cautionary tale about someone who had lost everything to legal fees or government seizure. The complexity terrified her, but it also clarified something important. She could not do this alone. Margaret had kept the secret by herself for decades, but Margaret had not needed to convert the gold into a future. Clara did. Lily needed that future, and building it would require help from someone who understood the terrain Clara was about to cross. Finding that person took time and care. Clara could not simply call a gold dealer or walk into an appraiser's office with a bar pulled from a hidden room. The wrong conversation with the wrong person could unravel everything. She needed someone who combined expertise with discretion, someone who would treat the situation with the seriousness it demanded without exploiting the vulnerability it created. The name came to her through an unlikely chain, a regular customer at the diner, an older man named Gerald, who came in every Thursday for the same meal and left the same modest tip. Mentioned during a conversation about antiques that his nephew worked with a firm that specialized in estate valuations for high-net-worth families. The nephew, Gerald explained with quiet pride, had handled cases involving rare collections, inherited assets, and objects whose value required specialized knowledge to assess. He was thorough, Gerald said, and more importantly, he was honest. Clara asked for the nephew's name with a casualness that cost her considerable effort. Gerald wrote it on a napkin. Thomas Whitfield. The name sat in Clara's pocket for 3 days before she found the courage to call. The conversation was brief and careful. Clara explained that she had inherited property that contained items of potential value and that she needed a confidential assessment. She did not mention gold. She did not mention the room or the passage or the journal. She offered only the minimum information necessary to establish that her request was legitimate and that discretion was essential. Thomas listened without interruption, asked 2 precise questions about the nature of the inheritance and the timeline for assessment, and scheduled a meeting for the following week. The meeting took place at a small office in a professional building on the edge of town. Thomas Whitfield was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps 40, with an expression that balanced warmth with professional reserve. His office was neat, but not ostentatious, lined with bookshelves that held volumes on art history, metallurgy, and estate law. He offered Clara coffee, which she declined because her hands were shaking enough already, and invited her to explain her situation. Clara spoke slowly and deliberately. She described the house, the inheritance, the attic that had been given to her, while her siblings received other portions of the property. She described the discovery of the hidden passage and the room behind the wall. She described the gold bars, the coins, the artifacts, the documents. She described Margaret's journal and the story it told. Thomas listened with the focused attention of someone trained to hear what was said and what was not. When Clara finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Thomas leaned back in his chair and studied her face with an expression that was neither skeptical nor credulous, but something in between. He asked if she had told anyone else. She said no. He asked if she had removed anything from the room. She said she had not. He nodded slowly, as though that answer confirmed something he had hoped to hear. He explained what would need to happen next, and his explanation was both reassuring and sobering. The first step was verification. He would need to see the room himself, examine a representative sample of the items, and conduct preliminary tests to confirm the authenticity and approximate quality of the gold. This could be done quietly and quickly, without involving anyone outside the two of them. If the gold was genuine, the second step would be a comprehensive inventory, a detailed catalog of every item in the room, including weight, dimensions, markings, and any identifiable provenance. This inventory would form the basis for a formal appraisal, which in turn would determine the collection's market value. The third step, and the most delicate, would be establishing legal ownership. Clara's inheritance of the attic was clear, but the contents of a hidden room within that attic raised questions that would need careful legal navigation. Margaret's journal would be valuable evidence, but it would need to be supplemented with whatever documentation existed regarding Robert Hollis's acquisition of the gold and Margaret's stewardship of it over the years. Thomas emphasized throughout that confidentiality was not just preferable, it was essential. Premature disclosure could trigger legal complications, family disputes, and even security risks that would be difficult to manage once they began. He suggested that Clara engage an attorney who specialized in estate and asset law, and he offered to recommend one he had worked with before, someone whose discretion matched his own. Clara left the meeting feeling something she had not felt in years. Not relief exactly, but the absence of a particular kind of loneliness. The secret was no longer hers alone. It was shared with someone who understood its weight and was equipped to help her carry it. The burden had not disappeared, but it had been redistributed in a way that made forward movement possible. Thomas visited the house 3 days later. Clara met him at the front door early in the morning, before the neighborhood stirred. They climbed to the attic together, and Clara watched his face as she slid the panel open and revealed the passage. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she noticed the slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible catch in his breathing when the flashlight beam first caught the gold on the shelves. He spent 2 hours in the room, moving with methodical care, examining bars and coins and documents with a precision that reminded Clara of a surgeon working in unfamiliar territory. He carried a small kit that contained testing equipment, a portable scale, a magnifying loupe, and tools she did not recognize. He spoke sparingly, noting observations into a small recorder, pausing occasionally to photograph markings or measure dimensions. When he emerged from the passage, his expression had shifted. The professional neutrality remained, but beneath it, Clara detected something she recognized because she had felt it herself. Awe. Not the theatrical kind, not the gasping disbelief of someone confronted by unexpected fortune, but the quiet, reverent awe of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at and appreciated both its beauty and its gravity. He sat across from Clara on the attic floor, surrounded by Margaret's boxes, and delivered his preliminary assessment in a voice that was steady but not casual. The gold bars were genuine, high purity, consistent with bullion produced during and after the mid-20th century. The markings on several bars corresponded to known foundries, which would aid in establishing provenance. The coins were a mixture of historical and modern pieces, some of considerable numismatic value beyond their metal content. The documents would require separate analysis, but his initial impression was that they included, bearer bonds, and certificates that might still hold significant value. He paused before delivering the number, not for dramatic effect, but because numbers this large demanded a moment of preparation on both sides. Based on his preliminary examination of the gold bars alone, weighing a representative sample and extrapolating across the visible inventory, the collection contained approximately 450 to 500 kilograms of gold. At current market prices, that placed the value of the bullion alone in the range of $28 to $32 million. Clara stared at him. The number landed in her mind but refused to settle. It hovered there, enormous and abstract, resisting the gravity of comprehension. Thomas continued. The coins, he estimated, could add another 3 to 5 million, depending on rarity and condition. The artifacts, the figurines and plates and frames would require individual assessment, but their craftsmanship suggested additional millions. And the documents, if they proved to be valid and redeemable, represented a category of value he could not estimate without expert review, but which historical precedent suggested could be substantial. He stopped speaking and let the silence carry the weight of what he had said. Clara's mind moved through the numbers slowly, as though wading through water. 30 million. Possibly more. Possibly much more. The figure was so far beyond anything she had ever imagined possessing that it felt like a number from someone else's life, a headline about a lottery winner or an inheritance in a movie, not something that applied to a woman who had spent the previous evening hand-sewing a zipper into a second-hand winter coat. She asked him to repeat the number. He did, calmly and without judgment. She asked if he was certain. He said he was confident in the estimate, but that the formal appraisal would provide exact figures. She asked what happened next. He said that the next step was the comprehensive inventory he had described, followed by the legal consultation that would establish Clara's rights and obligations. She thanked him, and her voice broke slightly on the word, not from sadness, but from the sheer pressure of emotion that had been building since the moment she first saw the gleam of gold through a gap in a stone wall. Thomas noticed, but did not comment. He simply nodded, gathered his equipment, and told her he would be in touch within the week to begin the formal process. Clara sat alone in the attic after he left. The pale light from the oval window fell across her lap, warming nothing. The boxes around her held Christmas ornaments and baby clothes and table linens, artifacts of a life lived in modesty. Every item saved because Margaret believed that what you kept mattered as much as what you spent. And behind the wall, hidden by stones and silence, would lay a fortune that Margaret had kept not out of greed, but out of love. Clara thought about Lily, about the apartment with the broken heating, about the car that coughed every morning like an old man clearing his throat, about the bills on the kitchen counter, and the credit card balance, and the 3 months of overdue rent. She thought about all of it, and then she let it go. Not permanently, not carelessly, but deliberately. Those problems would be solved. They would be solved carefully and correctly, and in a way that honored what Margaret had trusted her to protect. For now, Clara allowed herself something she had not allowed in years. She allowed herself to hope without qualification. Not the fragile, defensive hope that expected disappointment, but the full, an unguarded kind that believed the future could be different and was willing to act as though that belief was justified. She closed her eyes, leaned her head back against a box labeled quilts, handmade, and breathed. The weeks that followed moved with a rhythm that was both exhausting and purposeful. Clara continued working her 2 jobs, not because the money mattered in the way it once had, but because stopping would raise questions she was not ready to answer. The diner shifts and warehouse hours became a kind of camouflage, maintaining the appearance of the life everyone expected her to live, while the reality shifted beneath it, like tectonic plates. Thomas worked quickly but thoroughly. The comprehensive inventory took 4 visits, each one planned to coincide with times when the house was empty and the street was quiet. He cataloged every item in the room, weighed every bar, photographed every marking, and sealed representative samples in numbered containers for laboratory analysis. The work was painstaking, and Clara respected the care he brought to it. Each session ended with a brief update, and with each update, the numbers grew larger. The laboratory results confirmed what Thomas's preliminary tests had suggested. The gold was high purity, ranging from 91 to 99% across different items. Several bars bore markings traceable to Swiss and South American foundries, consistent with the mid-century timeline Margaret's journal described. The coins included a collection of pre-war European sovereigns whose numismatic value significantly exceeded their melt value, and a cache of American gold eagles that collectors would pursue aggressively. The documents required a different kind of expertise. Thomas connected Clara with a specialist in historical financial instruments, a quiet, meticulous woman named Dr. Helen Park, who examined the bearer bonds and certificates with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient manuscripts. Her assessment took longer than the gold analysis, but when it arrived, it redefined the scope of what Clara possessed. Several of the bearer bonds were still valid. They had been issued by institutions that continued to exist and honor their obligations. The certificates included shares in companies that had been absorbed by larger entities over the decades, their value compounding silently while they sat on shelves behind a hidden wall. Dr. Park's estimate for the combined value of the paper assets was conservative by her own admission, and even the conservative figure was staggering: $63 million, possibly more, pending verification of specific instruments that required direct communication with the issuing institutions. Clara received this number while sitting in her car outside Lily's school, waiting for the afternoon pickup. She held the phone against her ear and listened to Thomas relay Dr. Park's findings, and the world outside the windshield seemed to blur and sharpen simultaneously, as though reality itself was adjusting to accommodate a truth it had not anticipated. The combined value of the collection, Thomas told her, gold and coins and artifacts and documents together, was estimated at $341 million. Clara did not speak. She could not speak. The number existed in a realm so far beyond her daily experience that it might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. $341 million. Behind a wall in an attic that her family had given her because they believed it was worthless. Thomas waited on the line, patient and understanding. When Clara finally found her voice, it was smaller than she expected, almost a whisper. She asked him what she should do. He said that the first thing she should do was nothing. Nothing hasty, nothing public, nothing that could not be undone. The legal framework needed to be established before any action was taken. The attorney he had recommended, a woman named Sandra Chen, was ready to begin that process whenever Clara gave the word. Clara gave the word. Sandra Chen was precisely the kind of person Clara would never have encountered in her ordinary life. Impeccably composed, fiercely intelligent, and possessed of a calm authority that could silence a room without raising her voice. She worked from an office in the city, 2 hours from Clara's apartment, and their first meeting lasted 4 hours. Sandra's approach was methodical. She reviewed the will, the property records, Margaret's journal, and Thomas's appraisal with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details at this level carried consequences measured in millions. She explained the legal landscape to Clara with a directness that was both frightening and reassuring. The good news, Sandra said, was that Clara's ownership of the attic was unambiguous. The will was clear, properly executed, and had been filed without challenge. The contents of the attic, including anything built into or concealed within its walls, fell under Clara's portion of the inheritance. Harold Briggs's careful drafting of the will, with its clause granting each recipient full autonomy over their designated portion, strengthened Clara's position further. The hidden room was physically located within the attic's boundaries. Its contents belonged to Clara. The more complex news involved the gold's provenance. Robert Hollis had recovered the gold from illicit channels decades ago, and while his intentions were honorable, the legal status of recovered wartime assets was a labyrinth of international law, statute of limitations, considerations, and jurisdictional ambiguity. Sandra believed that the passage of time, combined with the lack of any active claims against the specific items in the collection, placed Clara in a defensible position. But defensible was not the same as guaranteed, and Sandra counseled caution at every turn. The tax implications were significant, but manageable. Inherited assets received a stepped-up basis, meaning Clara's tax obligation would be calculated based on the value at the time of inheritance, rather than the original acquisition cost. Sandra estimated the tax liability at between $60 and $70 million, a number that made Clara's stomach lurch until Sandra reminded her that even after taxes, she would retain well over $250 million. Over $250 million. For a woman who had spent the previous week deciding whether she could afford to buy Lily a new pair of shoes or whether the old ones could last another month. Sandra outlined a plan that would unfold over the following months. Quiet liquidation of select assets through established channels. Establishment of a trust to protect the wealth and provide for Lily's future. Careful management of the transition from discovery to realization, ensuring that every step was legal, documented, and defensible against any challenge. Clara agreed to everything Sandra proposed. She signed documents with a hand that had steadied over the week since the discovery, though it still trembled occasionally when the full weight of the numbers pressed against her comprehension. She trusted Sandra the way she trusted Thomas, not because she had known them long, but because Margaret's gift had taught her something about trust itself. It was not given to those who earned it perfectly. It was given to those whose character aligned with the moment. While the legal and financial machinery moved quietly in the background, the family's pressure continued to build on the surface. Richard's calls became more frequent and more pointed. He had retained his own attorney, who sent a formal letter to Harold Briggs requesting mediation of the property dispute. The letter argued that Clara's refusal to sell was causing measurable financial harm to the other heirs and requested that the court compel a sale. Harold, who had anticipated this possibility decades in advance thanks to Margaret's foresight, responded with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years defending a will he had crafted to withstand exactly this kind of assault. The will's autonomy clause, he explained in a reply that was courteous but unyielding, granted each heir independent authority over their portion. No court could compel Clara to sell her share against her will, and any attempt to do so would violate the explicit terms of the document. Richard's attorney pushed back. Harold pushed harder. The exchange continued for weeks, each letter more technical than the last, building a wall of legal language that Clara did not fully understand, but that Sandra assured her was impenetrable. Victoria took a different approach. She arrived at Clara's apartment on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and an expression of calculated sympathy. She sat at Clara's kitchen table, in the same chair where Lily did her homework, and spoke in a tone that was softer and more personal than any she had used before. She told Clara she understood. She said she knew what it was like to feel attached to family history, to want to hold on to something that reminded you of someone you loved. But sentiment, she said gently, could not pay bills. The house was an asset, and assets existed to be used. Holding on to the attic while the rest of the family waited was not honoring Margaret's memory. It was distorting it. Clara listened, as she always did. She noticed that Victoria had not asked about Lily, had not commented on the cold apartment or the stack of bills visible on the counter. She noticed that the wine was expensive, a detail that spoke volumes about the gap between their lives. She noticed that Victoria's sympathy, however well performed, did not extend to curiosity about Clara's reasons, only to the desire to change Clara's mind. When Victoria finished, Clara said simply that she was keeping the attic. She did not explain. She did not defend. She let the words stand on their own, as solid and unmovable as the stones behind the wall. Victoria left with the wine bottle still half full and her expression no longer soft. Clara washed the 2 glasses, dried them, and placed them back in the cabinet. Then she sat down and allowed herself a moment of something that felt remarkably close to satisfaction. Dennis's approach was cruder. He called Clara late one night, his voice thick with frustration, and something Clara suspected was alcohol. He told her she was selfish. He told her she was ungrateful. He told her that Margaret had always favored her, and that the attic was proof of the old woman's cruelty, giving the least to the one she liked most as a final joke. He said that if Clara did not agree to sell by the end of the month, he would make her life difficult in ways she could not imagine. Clara let him talk until the energy drained from his voice, and silence filled the line. Then she told him she was sorry he was hurting, and that she hoped he would find peace with the situation. She hung up before he could respond, not out of anger, but out of the understanding that no words she could offer would change what Dennis felt, and no words he could offer would change what she had decided. The month ended without resolution. Richard's legal challenge stalled against Harold's defenses. Victoria's diplomatic campaign achieved nothing. Dennis's threats dissolved into the empty posturing they had always been. The house stood on Maple Ridge Lane, unchanged and indifferent, its secrets intact, its future quietly, irrevocably shifting beneath the surface. During this time, Clara made her 3rd visit to the room. This visit was different from the first 2. She did not come to discover or to inventory. She came to sit. She brought a folding chair from the attic, carried it through the passage, and placed it in the center of the room, among the gold and the silence. She sat there for nearly an hour, surrounded by shelves of wealth that she still had not fully internalized, and she thought about Margaret. She thought about the years Margaret had spent in this house, walking above this room, sleeping above it, cooking dinner and washing dishes while beneath her feet lay a fortune she could have used at any time. Margaret had never upgraded her car, had never renovated the kitchen, had never taken a vacation or bought expensive clothes or moved to a nicer neighborhood. She had lived modestly, deliberately, and with a contentment that Clara now understood was rooted not in ignorance of what she possessed, but in the conscious choice to value other things more highly. Margaret had valued the house. She had valued her family, despite its flaws. She had valued the quiet rhythm of a life lived on her own terms. And she had valued Clara, not as the least of the grandchildren, but as the one most likely to understand that gold on a shelf was less important than love given freely. That Clara sat in that room and let Margaret's presence fill the space around her. The gold gleamed softly in the light from her flashlight, patient and unchanged, and Clara felt something settle inside her that had been restless for as long as she could remember. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. It was alignment. The sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, carrying something precious, not because she deserved it more than anyone else, but because she would carry it well. When she stood, she placed her hand flat against the nearest shelf and let the cold metal of the gold bar press against her palm. A silent promise passed between them, or between Clara and Margaret, and the room and the house, and the future that was taking shape in the quiet spaces where no one else could see. She left the room, closed the passage, and descended the stairs with a steadiness that felt permanent. The formal appraisal process continued through the winter. Thomas and his team worked with discretion that Clara had come to depend on, and Sandra's legal framework grew more robust with every filing. The trust was established in February, structured to protect the assets while providing Clara with access to funds as they were carefully liquidated. The first sale, a small selection of gold coins routed through an established auction house under Sandra's oversight, generated $4.7 million after fees and taxes, so Clara received the funds in a bank account she had opened specifically for this purpose. The number on the screen was the first concrete proof that the discovery had crossed from potential into reality. She stared at it for a long time, sitting in her car outside the bank, the engine running, the heater blowing warm air that she no longer needed to ration. She did not buy anything immediately. She did not quit her jobs. She did not move. Instead, she drove to Lily's school, picked up her daughter, and took her to the park, where they sat on a bench and watched the ducks navigate the pond with the casual competence of creatures who had never worried about anything more pressing than the next piece of bread. Lily leaned against Clara's shoulder and asked if they could get ice cream. Clara said yes. Lily asked if they could get the big kind, what with sprinkles. Clara said yes to that too. They walked to the ice cream shop hand in hand, and Clara ordered 2 large cones with sprinkles, and when Lily's face lit up with the uncomplicated joy that only children can achieve, Clara felt the last remaining wall inside her give way. Not with a crash, but with a sigh, like a door opening onto a room full of light. The ice cream cost $6.40. It was the best money Clara had ever spent. Spring arrived with a subtlety that matched the transformation happening in Clara's life. The trees along Maple Ridge Lane budded cautiously, their branches testing the air before committing to leaves. The house stood among them, unchanged on the outside, though Clara noticed that the ivy on the eastern wall had grown another few inches during the winter, reaching higher as though trying to touch the attic window. She had begun making quiet improvements. The leaking section of roof above the attic was repaired by a contractor she hired directly, paying in cash and asking only that the work be done thoroughly and without conversation. The oval window was resealed, its warped glass cleaned for the first time in years, now admitting a cleaner, brighter light that transformed the attic from a dim storage space into something closer to a sanctuary. She replaced the worn treads on the staircase and oiled the hinges on the door at the bottom so that it opened smoothly rather than groaning in protest. These changes were small enough to escape notice. Richard, who visited the ground floor occasionally to check on his renovation plans, did not climb higher than the 2nd floor. Victoria had not been to the house since the will was read. Dennis had stopped contacting Clara entirely, his silence carrying a petulance that she found easier to bear than his words. The wider family began to notice something else, though. Clara looked different, not in any specific way they could identify, but in the aggregate of small changes that accumulate when a person stops living in fear. She stood straighter. She spoke more clearly. She smiled at Lily without the shadow of worry that had lived behind her eyes for years. She was still the same Clara, still quiet, still modest, still wearing shoes that were slightly past their prime. But the energy around her had shifted, and people who paid attention could feel it. The neighbors on Maple Ridge Lane noticed too, though their attention was drawn more by Clara's regular presence at the house than by any change in her demeanor. She came several times a week now, always alone, always staying for a few hours before leaving without explanation. The elderly woman next door watched from behind her curtain with an expression that mixed curiosity with something older and more complicated. She had known Margaret for decades. She had seen families come and go from that house without understanding why. But she recognized in Clara the same quality she had recognized in Margaret, a quiet stubbornness that refused to be moved by the opinions of others. One afternoon, as Clara was locking the front door, the elderly neighbor appeared on the sidewalk between their properties. She did not approach, but she called out in a voice that carried more warmth than Clara had heard from her before. She said that Margaret would be glad to know someone was taking care of the house. Then she turned and walked back inside without waiting for a response, leaving Clara standing on the porch with the key in her hand and a tightness in her throat that she did not try to explain away. The legal process moved forward with the deliberate pace that Sandra insisted upon. Additional sales were conducted through the spring and summer, each one carefully structured to minimize tax exposure and avoid attracting attention. The trust grew steadily, its balance climbing past figures that would have seemed fictional to Clara a year ago. Thomas continued to work through the inventory, and each new assessment refined the total value upward, as particularly rare coins and artifacts proved more valuable than initial estimates had suggested. By midsummer, the liquidated portion of the collection had generated over $47 million. The remaining assets, still shelved in the room behind the attic wall, represented another $290 million in estimated value, a number that continued to shift as market conditions changed and as Dr. Park's analysis of the bearer bonds and certificates progressed. Clara's personal circumstances changed gradually and intentionally. She moved first. The apartment with the broken heating was replaced by a modest house in a decent neighborhood, close enough to Lily's school that the morning commute became a walk rather than a drive. The house was not large or impressive. It had 3 bedrooms, a small yard with a tree that Lily claimed immediately as her own, and a kitchen with a window that let in morning light. Clara chose it not because it was the best she could afford, but because it was the right size for the life she wanted to live. She quit the warehouse job in June. The diner job lasted 2 more months, partly because Clara was not ready to lose the routine, and partly because she wanted to leave on her own terms rather than vanishing in a way that would invite questions. When she finally told the manager she was moving on, she thanked him sincerely for the years of work and left a tip in the jar that was larger than any she had ever received. Lily noticed the changes with the adaptive clarity of childhood. She did not ask why they had a new house or why her mother seemed less tired. She simply accepted the new reality with the same ease she accepted sunshine after rain. She decorated her room with drawings and claimed the largest shelf in the bookcase for her expanding collection of library books. She asked if they could get a dog. Clara said they would think about it, which in the language of mothers everywhere meant yes, but not yet. The world Clara built around Lily was deliberate in its modesty. There were no extravagant purchases, no sudden displays of wealth, no changes dramatic enough to attract attention or invite questions. Clara understood intuitively what Sandra reinforced explicitly, that the transition from poverty to wealth was a journey best traveled quietly. Every decision she made was filtered through a question Margaret might have asked. Does this serve the life we want, or does it serve the appearance of a life we think we should want? The answer kept Clara grounded. It kept her patient. It kept her focused on what mattered, not the gold itself, but what the gold could become in the hands of someone who valued people more than things. By autumn, the first phase of Sandra's plan was complete. The trust was fully funded and legally fortified. Clara's ownership of the collection was established beyond challenge, supported by Margaret's journal, Robert's recovered documentation, and the careful provenance work Thomas and his team had conducted. The tax obligations had been met, every dollar accounted for, every filing precise. Clara Hollis, single mother, former warehouse worker and waitress, the least of the Hollis grandchildren, was worth over $270 million. The number existed on paper and in accounts, but it did not yet exist in the awareness of anyone outside Clara's small circle of trusted advisors. The family did not know. The neighbors did not know. The world at large had no reason to suspect that the quiet woman who walked her daughter to school every morning carried a secret that would have made headlines in any newspaper on the continent. Clara intended to keep it that way for as long as possible, not out of deception, but out of the understanding that some transformations required privacy to take root. Wealth announced too soon became a target. Wealth managed quietly became a foundation. But foundations, no matter how carefully laid, eventually become visible. And the moment was approaching when Clara would have to decide how much of the truth to share, and with whom, and what the consequences of that sharing would be. The family meeting happened in October, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret's death. It was not planned by Clara. Richard convened it, using language that suggested compromise, but carried the undertone of ultimatum. He had spent the year frustrated by the legal stalemate, watching his investment timeline stretch further with each passing month. The property sat unsold, its value slowly eroding under the weight of maintenance costs and property taxes that all 4 heirs were technically responsible for, though Clara had been paying her share quietly and on time, while the others had let their portions lapse. The meeting took place at Harold Briggs's office, the same wood-paneled room where the will had been read a year before, the same chairs, the same faint smell of pipe tobacco and leather. Clara arrived first, dressed simply, carrying nothing but her purse and the calm certainty that had become her most reliable possession. Richard arrived next, his suit slightly rumpled, his expression carrying the tension of a man who had been losing a fight he believed he should have won easily. Victoria followed, composed and polished, her greeting to Clara so carefully neutral that it could have been cut from glass. Dennis came last, looking thinner than Clara remembered, his restlessness visible in the way his eyes moved around the room without settling on anything. Harold opened the meeting by restating the terms of the will and the legal positions that had been established over the past year. His tone was measured, his words precise, and each one placed with the deliberation of a man who understood that this room held more than legal documents. It held a family, or what remained of one. Richard spoke first. He had prepared a proposal, a buyout arrangement in which the 3 majority holders would compensate Clara for her portion of the property at fair market value, freeing the house for a unified sale. The price he offered was $40,000, his estimate of the attic's standalone value based on square footage and condition. He presented the figure with the confidence of someone who believed numbers told the whole story. Clara looked at the paper Richard slid across the table. $40,000. For an attic that contained, behind its hidden wall, a collection worth over $300 million. She did not laugh. The contrast was too enormous for humor. Instead, she folded her hands on the table and spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. She told them she was not selling. Not now. Not at any price Richard was prepared to offer. She told them the attic was hers, that its value was hers to determine, and that the will granted her the right to keep it for as long as she chose. She said all of this without anger, without defensiveness, without the trembling voice they might have expected from the Clara they thought they knew. Richard's face darkened. Victoria's composure cracked, just slightly, around the edges. Dennis shifted in his chair and looked away, as though the conversation had become too uncomfortable to witness directly. Harold watched all of this with the patient attention of a man who had seen it before and would see it again. He said nothing, allowing the silence to do the work that words could not. The meeting ended without agreement. Richard left first, his departure marked by the same decisive door closing that had punctuated every exit since the reading of the will. Victoria offered Clara a look that contained layers of frustration and something that might have been the beginning of doubt. Dennis simply left, his truck starting with a cough that reminded Clara, absurdly, of her old car. Clara sat alone in Harold's office for a few minutes after the others had gone. Harold offered her tea, and this time she accepted. They sat together in the quiet room, sipping from cups that were probably older than Clara, and Harold told her something he had been holding back since the will was read. He said that Margaret had come to see him 3 months before she died. She had been lucid and deliberate, as she always was. She had reviewed the will one final time, made a single adjustment to the language of the autonomy clause to ensure it was airtight, and then she had looked at Harold and said something he had never forgotten. She said, "Clara will find what I left for her, and when she does, she will know what to do with it." Harold did not ask Clara what Margaret had meant. He did not need to. The look on Clara's face told him everything, and the tears that followed told him the rest. Clara drove home through streets painted with the gold and red of autumn, the trees shedding their leaves with the same quiet generosity that Margaret had shown in leaving her gift. The world outside the car windows moved at its usual pace, unhurried and unaware, and Clara moved with it, her hand steady on the wheel, her heart full of something that had no name, but felt like every good thing she had ever known, gathered together and held close. Lily was waiting at home, sitting on the front steps of their new house, with a book open on her lap, and a look of concentration that reminded Clara so powerfully of Margaret that her breath caught in her chest. Lily looked up as Clara's car pulled into the driveway, and her face broke into a smile that was worth more than everything behind the wall. Clara got out of the car, walked to the steps, and sat down beside her daughter. She did not speak about the meeting, or the money, or the future. She simply sat, shoulder to shoulder, with the person she loved most in the world, and let the autumn sun warm them both. The gold could wait. It was patient. It had always been patient. And Clara, who had learned patience from a woman who had mastered it over 53 years in a house on Maple Ridge Lane, was content to let it wait a little longer. The truth, like most things Clara had learned to respect, revealed itself on its own schedule. She had not planned the moment. She had not rehearsed it, or staged it, or timed it for maximum effect. The discovery became public the way water finds cracks in a dam, not through a single dramatic breach, but through the slow, steady accumulation of pressure that eventually made containment impossible. It began with the property taxes. Richard, who had been covering the ground floor's share intermittently and with increasing resentment, received a notice from the county assessor's office indicating that improvements had been made to the property. The notice was routine, one triggered by the roofing work Clara had commissioned months earlier, but it listed the attic as the location of the improvement and included a revised assessment that reflected the repair. Richard, who monitored every financial detail related to the house with the vigilance of a man protecting an investment he considered rightfully his, noticed the discrepancy immediately. He called Clara on a Wednesday evening, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who had discovered an inconsistency and intended to follow it to its source. He asked about the roof repair. Clara confirmed it. He asked who had paid for it. Clara said she had. He paused, and in that pause, Clara could hear the machinery of his mind recalculating. Clara, who could barely afford rent 6 months ago, now had paid for a roof repair on a property she supposedly valued only for sentimental reasons. The arithmetic did not align, and Richard was not a man who tolerated misaligned arithmetic. He asked, carefully, where the money had come from. Clara told him it was not his concern. The attic was hers. Its maintenance was her responsibility, and she had fulfilled that responsibility. The conversation ended with Richard's silence, which was more dangerous than his words had ever been. The second crack appeared through Victoria's network. Victoria moved in circles where information traveled quickly, and discretion was a commodity rather than a virtue. Someone at the auction house where Clara's coins had been sold mentioned, in passing, at a dinner party Victoria happened to attend, that a remarkable collection of pre-war gold sovereigns had recently come to market through an estate in the region. The details were vague, but Victoria's instinct for relevance was sharp. She filed the information away and began asking questions of her own. The third crack was Dennis, though not through any intentional act. Dennis, who had largely withdrawn from the family dispute, happened to drive past the house on Maple Ridge Lane one afternoon and noticed a vehicle he did not recognize parked in the driveway. It was Thomas Whitfield's car, though Dennis had no way of knowing that. What he noticed was that the car was expensive, far more expensive than anything Clara drove, and that its presence at the house during a weekday suggested activity that Clara had not disclosed. Dennis mentioned this to Richard. Richard connected it to the roof repair. Victoria connected both to the auction house rumor. And suddenly, the three siblings who had spent a year dismissing Clara's attachment to the attic as sentimental foolishness began to wonder whether they had been wrong about what the attic contained. Richard was the first to act. He retained a private investigator, a decision he made without consulting Victoria or Dennis, though both would later claim they had supported it from the beginning. The investigator was competent, but ultimately unnecessary, because by the time his preliminary report arrived, Clara had already made her own decision about disclosure. She made that decision on a Sunday morning in November, 13 months after Margaret's death. She was sitting in the kitchen of her new house, watching Lily draw at the table, and when her phone rang, it was Richard, and his tone was different from any she had heard before. The controlled frustration was gone. In its place was something rawer and more honest. He said he knew something was happening with the house. He said he did not understand what, but that the evidence was accumulating in ways he could no longer ignore. He asked Clara, not demanded, but asked to tell him the truth. Clara listened to the change in his voice and recognized it for what it was. Not humility exactly, but the closest thing Richard had ever come to it. The armor of certainty he had worn for a year had developed cracks of its own, and through those cracks, something human was beginning to show. She told him she would explain everything, but not on the phone, and not alone. She wanted the entire family present, and she wanted it to happen at the house. Richard agreed without argument, which told Clara more about his state of mind than any words could have. The gathering was arranged for the following Saturday. Clara arrived at the house on Maple Ridge Lane early, before the others, and spent an hour in the attic preparing. She did not open the passage or reveal the room, not yet. Instead, she arranged chairs in a circle near the oval window and placed Margaret's journal on a small table in the center. The morning light fell across the leather cover, illuminating the cracks and creases that mapped the years of Margaret's life like lines on a palm. Richard arrived precisely on time, his punctuality a form of control he maintained, even when everything else was uncertain. He wore a suit, which struck Clara as both characteristic and slightly absurd for a Saturday morning in an attic. Victoria came minutes later, her composure intact, but her eyes betraying a curiosity she could not fully suppress. Dennis arrived last, as always, his truck announcing him before he appeared at the top of the stairs, slightly out of breath and visibly uncomfortable in a space he had not visited since childhood. They sat in the chairs Clara had arranged, three siblings who had spent a year fighting over a house they believed they understood, gathered in the one room they had all dismissed as worthless. The attic surrounded them with Margaret's boxes and Margaret's memories, and the oval window let in light that was softer and warmer than any of them had expected. Clara stood. She did not stand because she wanted to tower over them or assert authority. She stood because what she was about to say required her full height, her full presence, the complete and undiminished version of herself that Margaret had always seen, even when no one else had. She began with the journal, She picked it up from the table and held it so they could see the cover, cracked and worn, and she told them it had been written by their grandmother. She told them it contained a story none of them knew, a story about Robert Hollis and the work he had done in silence for decades, recovering what had been stolen and hiding it where no one would think to look. She told them about the room behind the wall, about the passage, about the gold and the coins and the artifacts and the documents that had been accumulating in darkness while the family lived and argued and grew apart above them. She did not dramatize. She did not embellish. She told the story the way Margaret had written it, plainly and with respect for the facts. And as she spoke, she watched the faces of her siblings change. Richard's expression moved through several stages in rapid succession. Disbelief came first, the reflexive rejection of information that contradicted everything he thought he knew. Then, calculation, the automatic assessment of numbers and implications that his mind performed, whether he wanted it to or not. Then, something Clara had never seen on her brother's face before, a kind of vertigo. The look of a man who has spent a year standing on what he believed was solid ground and has just been told the ground is made of paper. Victoria's composure held longer, but when it broke completely. Her lips parted, her carefully maintained posture collapsed inward, her shoulders curving, as though the weight of the revelation was physically pressing down on her. She stared at Clara with an expression that contained equal parts shock and something that looked almost like recognition, as though she was seeing her younger sister clearly for the first time and was startled by what she found. Dennis simply went pale. The color drained from his face in a visible wave, leaving him looking older and smaller than he had when he sat down. His hands gripped the arms of his chair with a force that whitened his knuckles, and his mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. Clara let the silence hold. She let them sit with what she had told them, let the information settle into the spaces where their assumptions had lived, displacing certainty with something messier and more honest. She watched them process, and she felt no satisfaction in their shock. She felt only the quiet sadness of knowing that this moment could have been different, if the family had been different, if they had trusted each other the way Margaret had trusted Clara. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle. She told them the value, $341 million. She said the number once, clearly, and let it stand in the attic air like a physical object, heavy and impossible to ignore. She told them about Thomas and Sandra and the legal framework that had been established to protect the collection. She told them about the trust, about the sales that had already been conducted, about the tax obligations that had been met. And then she told them something they did not expect. She told them she intended to share, not equally, not according to the terms of the will, which gave her sole ownership of the attic and everything within it. Not because she was obligated, legally or morally, to distribute what Margaret had entrusted to her care, but because Margaret had loved all of her grandchildren, even the ones who did not visit, even the ones who measured value in dollars rather than devotion. Margaret's love had been larger than her disappointment, and Clara intended to honor that. She explained what she had planned. A portion of the collection's value would be set aside for each sibling, enough to be transformative, enough to acknowledge the family bond that still existed beneath the layers of resentment and misunderstanding. The amounts would not be equal to Clara's share, because Margaret's will had been clear about who she trusted most, and Clara would not dishonor that trust by pretending the distinction did not matter. But they would be significant, life-changing, by any reasonable standard. Richard found his voice first. It was rougher than Clara had ever heard it, stripped of the polished confidence that normally coated every word. He asked why. Why would Clara share anything when the law gave her no reason to? Why would she show generosity to people who had spent a year trying to force her hand, Clara looked at her brother and answered with a simplicity that carried more weight than any legal argument or financial projection. She said that Margaret had taught her something about wealth that most people never learned, that its value was not in what it could buy, but in what it could build, that a fortune hoarded was a fortune wasted, and that the only measure of money that mattered was the measure of good it could do. She said that she was not sharing because Richard or Victoria or Dennis deserved it. She was sharing because Margaret would have wanted her to, and because Clara had learned, from years of having nothing, that the only thing worse than poverty was the kind of wealth that isolated you from the people you were meant to love. The room was quiet for a long time after that. The dust motes continued their patient drift in the light from the oval window. Margaret's boxes stood in their familiar stacks, labeled in handwriting that would never add another word. And 4 grandchildren sat in an attic that one of them had been given, and all of them had underestimated, confronting a truth that was larger than any of them had imagined. Victoria spoke next. Her voice was thin, stripped of the carefully constructed confidence she normally wore like armor. She did not say, "Thank you." Not yet. What she said was that she was sorry. The word seemed to cost her something enormous, as though it had been locked inside a room of its own for years and had to be pried loose by force. She did not specify what she was sorry for, but the look she gave Clara said everything the words did not. Sorry for the emails. Sorry for the condescension. Sorry for the wine-carrying visit that had been designed to manipulate rather than connect. Sorry for every moment she had looked at Clara and seen only the least. Dennis did not speak at all. He sat in his chair with his head bowed, his hands now loose in his lap, and Clara watched a single tear trace a line down his cheek before he wiped it away with the back of his hand. Dennis had never been cruel, not really. He had been desperate, which was a different kind of damage, one that Clara understood better than anyone else in the room. She walked over to him and placed her hand on his shoulder, and he reached up and covered it with his own, and they stayed like that for a moment that contained more honesty than a year of phone calls and threats and strained silences. Richard stood. He crossed the small space between his chair and Clara's, and for the first time in Clara's memory, he looked at her without the filter of judgment or calculation. His eyes were red, not from crying. Richard did not cry, but from the effort of holding back something he had been trained since childhood to suppress. He extended his hand, and Clara took it, and the handshake lasted longer than any business deal Richard had ever closed. He said 2 words, "Thank you," and then he sat down again, because standing required a composure he no longer fully possessed. Clara returned to her place by the oval window and let the moment breathe. She did not rush toward logistics or timelines or the practical details that would eventually need attention. She let the family sit together in the attic, and surrounded by gold they could not see and grief they had never properly shared, and she let the silence do what silence does best. It connected them, not through words, but through the shared recognition that something had changed and couldn't be unchanged. After a while, Clara asked if they wanted to see the room. The question was quiet, almost casual, as though she were offering tea rather than access to a hidden vault containing hundreds of millions of dollars in gold. But the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the significance of the offer. This room was Margaret's secret, and Margaret had trusted it to Clara alone. Sharing it with the others was an act of faith. A bridge extended across a gap that had been widening for years. They followed her to the far wall, where the paneling concealed the passage. Clara slid the panel open with a smoothness that came from practice, revealing the narrow entrance that still carried the scent of metal and stone and silence. She went first, flashlight in hand, and one by one they followed, ducking through the opening and moving single file through the brick-lined passage toward the room that had waited behind the wall for longer than any of them had been alive. Richard entered last, and his reaction was the most striking. He stopped in the doorway, one hand braced against the stone frame, and stared at the shelves with an expression that dismantled every assumption Clara had ever made about her brother's relationship to material things. She had expected calculation, expected him to begin estimating weights and prices and market conditions the moment the gold came into view. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his mouth slightly open, his eyes moving slowly from shelf to shelf, as though he were reading a story rather than appraising an inventory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a wonder that Clara had not heard from him since they were children exploring the attic together on rainy Saturday afternoons. He said it was beautiful, not valuable, not impressive, not significant. Beautiful. And Clara knew in that moment that the gold had done something to Richard that money alone could never have accomplished. It had reminded him of something he had forgotten, something about the difference between what things were worth and what they meant. Victoria moved through the room with the careful reverence of someone walking through a museum after hours. She touched nothing, but her eyes missed nothing either. She paused longest at the shelf holding the gold figurines, their features worn soft by decades of darkness, their craftsmanship still evident in the delicate lines of their forms. She asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether Margaret had known about these all along. Clara said yes. Victoria closed her eyes and stood very still, and Clara understood that her sister wasn't mourning the gold she had missed. She was mourning the grandmother she had not bothered to know. Dennis barely made it past the entrance before his legs gave out. He sank to a sitting position on the stone floor, his back against the brick wall, and looked up at the shelves towering above him with the stunned expression of a man who has just been told that everything he believed about the world was incomplete. He did not try to stand. He did not try to speak. He simply sat and absorbed the reality of what surrounded him, and Clara let him take as long as he needed. They stayed in the room for nearly an hour. Clara showed them Margaret's journal, still resting on the small table in the corner, and they passed it between them with hands that trembled slightly. Richard read the passage about Robert Hollis with an intensity that suggested he was meeting his grandfather for the first time. Victoria lingered over the pages, where Margaret described her years of quiet stewardship, adding to the collection, protecting it, waiting. Dennis read the final pages, addressed to Clara, and when he finished, he handed the journal back without a word. But the look he gave Clara carried an apology deeper and more sincere than anything language could construct. When they finally emerged from the room and descended the attic stairs, the house felt different. Not physically. The same sagging porch, the same stained gutters, the same ivy reaching upward along the eastern wall. But the air inside had shifted, charged with something new, something that resembled the beginning of understanding. They gathered in the kitchen, Margaret's kitchen, where the ceramic bowl still sat on the counter and the calendar on the wall still showed the wrong month. Clara made tea, using the same cups Margaret had always used, their faded patterns familiar and comforting. She poured 4 cups and set them on the table, and for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, the 4 Hollis grandchildren sat together without agenda, without argument, without the invisible walls that had divided them for years. The conversation that followed was practical in its content, but emotional in its undertones. Sandra Chen's framework was explained. Thomas Whitfield's role was outlined. The trust structure was described in terms simple enough for everyone to understand. Clara walked them through the plan with a confidence that surprised even herself, answering questions directly and honestly, deflecting nothing, hiding nothing. Richard asked about the legal implications of the gold's origin. Clara explained what Sandra had established and what remained uncertain. She did not minimize the complexity, but she also did not amplify the risk. The situation was manageable, she told them, as long as it was managed carefully. Victoria asked about the timeline, how long before the remaining assets could be liquidated, how long before the distributions Clara had promised would reach them. Clara answered that the process would take time, perhaps another year, perhaps longer. Sandra insisted on patience, and Clara had learned to trust Sandra's judgment the way she trusted Thomas's expertise and Harold's steadiness. Rushing would create vulnerabilities that careful pacing could avoid. Dennis asked only one question, and it was the one Clara had been waiting for. He asked how much Margaret had known about each of them. He asked whether the will's division of the house had been arbitrary or intentional. He asked whether Margaret had given Clara the attic because she loved her more, or because she loved them all differently. Clara answered carefully, choosing words that honored both the truth and the feelings in the room. She said that Margaret had known each of them completely, with the clear-eyed perception of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching people and understanding what drove them. She said the will was not a judgment, but a map. Margaret had given each of them the part of the house that reflected who they were, and she had trusted that, in time, they would understand why. Richard had received the ground floor because he valued control and stability, the foundation on which everything else rested. Victoria had received the bedrooms because she cared about comfort and presentation, the face the house showed to the world. Dennis had received the garage because he was a man of restless energy who needed space to work and room to figure things out. And Clara had received the attic because she was the one who looked up, who climbed higher, who believed that the most important things were often hidden in the places no one else bothered to explore. The room was quiet after that. The tea grew cold in their cups. The afternoon light shifted through the kitchen window, painting slow golden rectangles on the floor that moved imperceptibly toward the wall. Outside, the neighborhood continued its unhurried existence, cars passing occasionally, leaves drifting from the trees along Maple Ridge Lane, the elderly neighbor sweeping her driveway with the same methodical devotion she had practiced for decades. When they finally stood to leave, something had settled between them. Not resolution, not yet, not the clean and final closing of old wounds, but a beginning. The first tentative step toward a relationship rebuilt on foundations stronger than the ones they had started with. Richard shook Clara's hand again at the door, and this time his grip was not a gesture of transaction, but of connection. Victoria hugged Clara, briefly and tightly, and the hug carried the weight of words she wasn't yet ready to say, but was clearly beginning to form. Dennis simply nodded, his eyes still red, his expression carrying a rawness that Clara found more honest and more hopeful than any smile he could have offered. Clara stood on the porch and watched them leave, one by one, their cars pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the street in the same order they had always traveled. Richard first, Victoria next, Dennis last. The house stood behind her, solid and patient, its secrets no longer fully hidden, but not yet fully revealed to the world beyond its walls. She locked the front door and walked through the ground floor one last time. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway where family photographs had once lined the walls. Each room held memories that predated the gold and would outlast it, memories of birthday parties and holiday dinners and quiet Sunday afternoons when Margaret sat by the window and watched the world with the contented expression of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Clara climbed the stairs to the attic. She did not open the passage or enter the room. She simply stood in the center of the space, surrounded by boxes and furniture, and the lingering presence of a woman who had shaped her life more profoundly than she had understood until now. The oval window glowed with the last light of the afternoon, and the dust motes performed their endless, an unhurried waltz through the beam. She placed her hand flat against the section of paneling that concealed the passage and held it there. The wood was warm beneath her palm, heated by the attic air, and she imagined she could feel the weight of the gold through the wall, patient and eternal, unchanged by the drama that had unfolded around it. She whispered a thank you, not to the gold, but to Margaret. For the gift, yes, but also for the trust, for seeing her when no one else did, for believing that the quiet, struggling, overlooked youngest grandchild was exactly the person who should carry this forward. The months that followed transformed Clara's life with a steadiness that reflected the values Margaret had instilled. Sandra's plan continued to unfold with meticulous precision. Additional sales were conducted through spring and summer, each transaction structured to maximize value while minimizing exposure. The trust grew into a financial architecture that would sustain not just Clara and Lily, but future generations yet to be born. But before the money changed anything material, it changed something invisible. The dynamic between Clara and her siblings shifted in ways none of them could have predicted. Richard called Clara 2 weeks after the attic gathering, not about money or timelines or legal strategy, but to ask how Lily was doing in school. The question was awkward, delivered with the stilted formality of a man who had never learned to make casual conversation with a family member he had spent years dismissing. Clara recognized the effort it cost him and answered warmly, telling him about Lily's science project and the book she was reading about ocean animals. The call lasted 12 minutes, longer than any conversation they had shared in a decade that did not involve the house or the will. When it ended, neither of them remarked on how unusual it was. They simply said goodbye and meant it. Victoria's transformation was quieter, but perhaps more profound. She began visiting the house on Maple Ridge Lane, not to assess its market value or to pressure Clara toward a sale, but to sit in the kitchen where Margaret had spent her mornings. She brought flowers once, a small arrangement that she placed in a vase on the counter beside the ceramic bowl, and she told Clara that she had been thinking about all the Sundays Clara had spent here with Margaret, while the rest of them had stayed away. She did not ask for forgiveness, and Clara did not offer it, because what was needed between them was not absolution, but acknowledgement. Victoria acknowledged what she had missed, and Clara acknowledged that missing it had cost Victoria something real. That exchange, wordless in its deepest parts, was the beginning of a relationship neither of them had known they wanted. Dennis surprised everyone, including himself. He returned to the house one Saturday morning with a toolbox and spent the afternoon repairing the crooked mailbox at the end of the driveway. No one had asked him to do it. No one had mentioned it needed fixing. He simply showed up, worked in silence for 3 hours, and left the mailbox standing straight for the first time in years. When Clara noticed it the following day, she stood in the driveway and stared at it for a long time, understanding that Dennis had said something with his hands that his voice had never been able to express. He came back the following week and fixed the porch railing. The week after that, he repainted the shutters on the ground floor. Each repair was small, but their accumulation told a story of a man who was trying to rebuild something other than wood and metal. The distributions to the siblings were made in autumn, exactly as Clara had promised. Each one received a sum that was generous by any measure, enough to eliminate debt, secure futures, and provide the kind of stability that allowed people to make choices based on desire rather than desperation. Richard used his share to establish a development fund focused on affordable housing, a decision that surprised everyone who knew him and that Clara suspected was influenced by the afternoon he had spent in the room behind the wall, surrounded by gold he had not earned and humility he had not expected to feel. Victoria endowed a scholarship program for first-generation college students, funding it with a portion of her share and dedicating it to Margaret's memory. Dennis paid off every debt he had accumulated over years of drifting and enrolled in a technical program that channeled his restless energy into something structured and productive. The way each of them chose to use the money revealed something Margaret had understood long before any of them did. That generosity was not a trait people were born with, but a muscle that strengthened when given the chance to work. Richard had never thought about affordable housing until he stood in a room full of gold and realized that wealth without purpose was indistinguishable from emptiness. Victoria had never considered the barriers facing first-generation students until she confronted the barriers she herself had built between her family and her compassion. Dennis had never committed to anything long enough to finish it until he received a gift that demanded he become someone worthy of receiving it. Margaret's gold had done more than make them wealthy. It had made them better, or at least had given them the opportunity to become better, which was all any gift could truly offer. Clara's own use of the wealth was deliberate and considered. She purchased the house on Maple Ridge Lane outright, buying out her siblings' shares at prices that were generous enough to leave no room for resentment. The house became hers completely. Every floor, every room, every inch of the property that Margaret had loved for 53 years. She renovated it carefully, preserving what mattered and improving what needed help, guided by a principle that Margaret would have recognized and approved. Change what must be changed. Keep what must be kept. Know the difference. The town noticed the changes at the house before it understood their source. Contractors came and went with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had been asked to work thoroughly and without conversation. The roof was fully restored. The gutters were replaced. The exterior was painted in colors that honored the original palette, while brightening the facade enough to suggest renewal rather than replacement. The porch was rebuilt, its boards level and strong, its railing straight, its surface sanded smooth enough to invite sitting. The ivy on the eastern wall was trimmed back to a manageable height, though Clara left enough of it to preserve the character that Margaret had never minded, and that Clara had come to love. Neighbors watched the transformation with the attentive curiosity that small communities applied to any change in their midst. The elderly woman next door observed each improvement with an expression that shifted gradually from curiosity to satisfaction, as though she were watching a debt being repaid that only she and the house fully understood. Other neighbors, who had known Margaret only as the quiet old woman who lived alone in the big house at the end of the lane, began to see the property differently. It was no longer the aging relic that dragged down the street's appearance. It was becoming what it had always been underneath, a home that someone cared about deeply enough to maintain. Word eventually spread, as it always did in places where silence was a fragile commodity. The source of Clara's transformation became the subject of speculation that ranged from lottery winnings to a secret inheritance to an anonymous benefactor. Clara neither confirmed nor denied any theory. She simply lived her life with the same quiet consistency she had always practiced, and she let the house speak for itself. So the first holiday season after the revelation brought the family together in a way none of them had experienced since childhood. Clara hosted Thanksgiving at the house on Maple Ridge Lane, in the dining room that had been Margaret's pride, and that Clara had restored to its original warmth. The table was set with Margaret's wedding china, retrieved from the boxes in the attic and washed carefully by hand. The meal was prepared in the kitchen, where Margaret had cooked for 53 years, using recipes written on index cards in Margaret's handwriting, cards that Clara had found in a drawer and preserved like the treasures they were. Richard brought wine. Victoria brought dessert. Dennis brought nothing but himself, which was exactly enough. Lily sat at the head of the table, on a position Clara assigned her with the explanation that Nana Maggie would have wanted the youngest person in the room to have the best seat. Lily accepted this honor with the seriousness it deserved and proceeded to eat mashed potatoes with a focus that suggested she understood the gravity of the occasion, even if she could not have articulated why. The conversation around the table was imperfect. There were awkward pauses and careful word choices, and moments when old habits of dismissal or defensiveness flickered briefly before being extinguished by the awareness that something new was being built here, something that required effort and patience and the willingness to try again after failing. But there was also laughter, genuine and unforced, the kind that had not filled this room since Margaret was alive to provoke it. And when the meal was over and the dishes were cleared, the 4 Hollis grandchildren sat together in the living room and talked, not about money or property or the will, but about Margaret. They shared memories, some overlapping and some entirely private, and in the sharing they discovered a version of their grandmother that none of them had known alone, but that all of them, together, could finally see in full. The attic received special attention. Clara transformed it into a bright, warm space that served as both a sanctuary and a reminder. The boxes were organized. The furniture was restored where possible and respectfully retired where it was not. The oval window was replaced with glass that was clear and true, admitting light that fell across the floor in patterns that changed with the seasons. And the section of paneling that concealed the passage remained in place, its seam invisible, its secret preserved for as long as Clara chose to keep it. She established a foundation in Margaret's name, funded with a significant portion of the collection's value, dedicated to supporting families in financial crisis. The foundation provided emergency housing assistance, medical bill relief, and educational funding for children whose parents worked multiple jobs and still could not make the numbers add up. Clara chose these causes because she had lived them, because she knew what it felt like to lie awake, calculating whether the electricity would last the month, and because she believed that the best use of unexpected fortune was to prevent others from needing one. Lily grew up in the house on Maple Ridge Lane. She attended the local school, played in the backyard beneath the tree she had claimed as her own, and drew pictures that Clara taped to the refrigerator with the same reverence Margaret had once shown. She knew the house had a history, knew that her great-grandmother had lived there for decades, knew that the attic was special in ways that went beyond its view of the sky. The full truth would come later, when Lily was old enough to understand not just the value of what the house contained, but the responsibility that came with it. Clara never moved to a larger home, never upgraded to a lifestyle that would have attracted attention or invited the complications that extreme wealth often brought. She drove a reliable car, wore practical clothes, and continued to live with the quiet modesty that had been her nature long before the gold gave her a choice. She understood, in a way that few people of her means ever did, that wealth was not a destination, but a tool, and that tools were only as good as the hands that held them. The elderly neighbor next door lived to see the house restored. She watched from her porch as the new shutters went up and the ivy was trimmed back to a manageable height. One afternoon, she crossed the property line for the first time in years and told Clara that the house looked the way it had when Margaret first moved in, back when the paint was fresh and the porch stood straight and the mailbox did not lean. She said this with a smile that carried decades of memory and a satisfaction that needed no further explanation. Clara thanked her and invited her in for tea. They sat in the kitchen, in the same chairs where Clara and Margaret had spent so many Sunday afternoons, and they talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. The lavender scent that had once defined the house had been replaced by something newer, the smell of fresh paint and polished wood, and the particular warmth that came from a home that was actively loved rather than merely maintained. When the neighbor left, Clara stood in the kitchen and looked around the room that had been the heart of the house for as long as anyone could remember. The ceramic bowl still sat on the counter, empty now of reading glasses, but full of something less tangible and more important. The calendar on the wall had been replaced with a current one, but Clara had kept the old one, off tucked into a drawer alongside Margaret's journal and the brass key on its faded ribbon. She walked through the house slowly, room by room, floor by floor, listening to the sounds it made. The creak of the stairs, the whisper of air through the hallway, the gentle settling of a structure that had carried the weight of lives and secrets and love for longer than Clara had been alive. Each sound was a conversation, just as it had been for Margaret. Familiar voices that said, "You are not alone." She climbed the stairs to the attic one last time that evening. The space was golden with the light of the setting sun, pouring through the new window and painting the walls with color that seemed to come from the house itself rather than the sky. Clara sat in the rocking chair she had restored, its runner repaired, its wood polished until it gleamed, and she looked out at the world below. The backyard stretched toward the tree line, green and tended. The neighboring houses stood in their familiar row, their lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled in. The street was quiet, the air still, the sky stained with the deep orange and purple of a sunset that demanded nothing but appreciation. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, the Clara who drove a car held together by prayer, the Clara who wore shoes until the soles disappeared and then wore them a little longer, the Clara who lay awake, calculating whether the electricity would last the month, who counted coins on the kitchen table while her daughter slept, who smiled through exhaustion because showing weakness felt like a luxury she could not afford. That Clara had not vanished. She lived inside the woman sitting in this rocking chair, woven into the fabric of who Clara was and would always be. Poverty did not leave a person simply because money arrived. It left its marks, its lessons, its particular kind of wisdom that could not be acquired any other way. Clara carried those marks with gratitude rather than shame. They were the reason Margaret had chosen her. They were the reason she knew that a winter coat from a thrift store, repaired by hand at a kitchen table, held more value than its price tag could ever reflect. They were the reason she understood that the gold behind the wall was not the treasure. It had never been the treasure. The treasure was the understanding that some things matter more than money, and that the people who know this are the only ones who can be trusted with wealth. She thought about the families the foundation would help, women like her, working 2 jobs, calculating every expense, lying awake with numbers swimming behind their eyes. Children like Lily, wearing last year's coat, eating meals made from whatever the pantry held, learning too early that the world charged admission for everything, including dignity. The foundation would not solve poverty. Nothing could solve poverty for everyone, everywhere, all at once. But it could catch the people who were falling. It could hold them long enough for them to find their footing. It could give them the one thing Clara had lacked for so many years, the knowledge that someone, somewhere, saw them and believed they deserved a chance. Margaret's journal had said it best. The house knows who belongs to it. Clara had read those words 100 times since finding them, and each time they revealed a new layer of meaning. The house had known Margaret. It had known Robert before her, the quiet man who moved through the world unnoticed while doing work that would have made headlines if anyone had been brave enough to publish them. And it knew Clara now, the woman who had inherited not just gold, but a philosophy, a way of being in the world that valued patience over speed, grace over vengeance, and love over every other currency the world had ever invented. Lily's voice floated up from somewhere below, singing a song she had learned at school, the melody slightly off-key, but delivered with the total commitment that only children could muster. Clara listened and smiled, and the smile was not the careful, weighted smile she had worn for years, and the one that concealed worry behind warmth. It was unguarded and complete, the smile of a woman who had found what she needed, not in the gold behind the wall, but in the life she had built around it. She wondered what Lily would think, years from now, when the full truth was revealed to her. When she was old enough to understand the numbers, the history, the weight of what her great-grandmother had entrusted to them. Clara hoped she would react the way Margaret would have wanted. Not with excitement about the money, but with awe at the love that had protected it. Not with plans for spending, but with questions about purpose. Not with the assumption that wealth was an ending, but with the understanding that it was a beginning, a responsibility disguised as a gift, a test dressed as a reward. Clara would raise Lily to pass that test. She would teach her what Margaret had taught Clara, not through lectures or lessons, but through the daily, unremarkable act of living with integrity. She would show her that strength was quiet, that generosity was not measured in dollars but in attention, and that the most powerful thing a person could do with a fortune was to use it in service of people who had never dreamed of having one. Margaret had known. She had always known. The house did not choose people at random. It waited for the one who would understand that its greatest treasure was not hidden behind stones and silence, but alive in the laughter of a child and the patience of a woman who had learned to endure and, at last, to flourish. Clara rested her hand on the arm of the rocking chair and let the evening surround her. The gold was behind the wall, patient as always, or its value measured in numbers that most people could not comprehend. But its true worth, the worth that Margaret had spent a lifetime protecting, was measured in something else entirely. In the foundation that bore Margaret's name, in the families it would help, in the daughter growing up in a house full of love and history, in the knowledge that endurance, when paired with grace, was the most valuable thing a person could possess. The attic was quiet. The house was warm. The future stretched forward, not as a threat or a question, but as a promise kept. Clara closed her eyes and rocked gently in the chair her grandmother had once sat in, and the house settled around her with a sound that was not creaking or groaning or protesting, but something closer to a sigh. The contented exhale of a structure that had finally, after 53 years of keeping its secret, placed its trust in the right hands. Outside, the last light of the sun touched the roofline and slipped below the horizon. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then brighter, scattered across the sky like gold dust on dark velvet. Lily's singing faded into the contented silence of a home at peace, and somewhere in the space between the walls, in the room where history and fortune waited side by side, the legacy of Margaret Hollis continued its quiet, steady work. Not ending, never ending, simply waiting, as it always had, for the next chapter to begin. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.